how do they tease out? I was thinking about, the increase in heart-related conditions around the pandemic and following the pandemic. And in much of your work, and I think in this book, I can't actually pronounce the word, POP diet?
POP diet, yeah.
The POP diet. You talk about how these other sort of lifestyle factors like community, friendships, relationships, stress, mental health, being sedentary, all of these things can contribute to heart problems. So when I think about the pandemic, I go, people weren't seeing their friends. We were stressed more than ever. People were losing their jobs. They were furloughed.
Yeah.
They had mental health. We saw the mental health stats explode.
Yeah.
All the factors there that are linked to heart disease. So how do we know that it wasn't those factors of the pandemic that caused an increase in heart-related issues? And how can we tease that out from the vaccine?
Really good question. Because remember, I also said that early on before I realized the vaccine might be playing a role. I actually thought that was the most likely explanation of the increased heart attacks, lockdown stress, poor diet, etc.
You would expect to see an increase in
You would. And I think it has played a role, Steve, for sure. It has played a role. But then when you look at the quality of data to say how much of a role that's played, it's on a different level. When you look at the vaccine, when you look at the plausible mechanism, you look at the types of people that are dying, young people and stuff like that, it doesn't fit. I'll be honest, my personal view, it is a primary driver, without any shadow of a doubt, in my mind, and a personal view of the excess deaths. As a scientist, I'll say it's a likely significant contributing factor, but probably the most likely, because another aspect to all of this is what we call pharmacovigilance reports. So these are reports that are done by members of the public when they have an adverse reaction to any drug, and it's not easy to fill in. You fill in these, what we call yellow card scheme. You can get it online, and you send it off to your doctor or to the regulator. Those reports, and throughout my career, I've never seen the extent. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. After 9.7 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was ultimately pulled, right? AstraZeneca, of course, was also one of the COVID vaccines. There were 800,000 in this country, 800,000 yellow card reports. Now, some of them are not going to be serious, but people don't fill in a yellow card report if you've had a bit of a fever after having a vaccine. They've felt quite ill enough. So that's already, and then within that, it's estimated maybe 1 in 5 of those from other data would suggest serious harm. So other data from reporting, and with about, I think, 30 million doses, if it was probably about 30 million doses of Pfizer, we had about 500,000 yellow card reports in this country, right? Which is still a lot. That's 1 in 60 yellow card reports. Now, they're all not going to be super serious, hospitalization, death, or whatever else. But when you put all of the data together, Steve, that it paints a picture that makes it look as clear as day. That anybody doubting, it should be, the evidence should be, this is the primary cause of the excess deaths until proven otherwise. That's the level of evidence, Steve. But it's just being ignored. It's being ignored. And I can talk about why it's being ignored.
One of the things I've been sort of gaps in my head that I've been keen to fill is, do you believe that if we hadn't have introduced the vaccine, more or less people would have survived COVID? Because I've got close friends of mine that got COVID, and I watched them go from very healthy looking people to basically skeletons. Good friend, one of the CEOs of my company, his dad went from being a very healthy man to being basically looking like a skeleton and almost died. And then I know of other people that did die. So I think in the grand scheme of things, when we think about vaccines, was it a net positive that we had a vaccine?
There is, from everything I know now, I've slowly and reluctantly come to the conclusion that the COVID vaccine introduction has had a catastrophic overall net negative effect on the population and society. And and let me just caveat this, because you've mentioned the fact that people suffered from COVID, and I'm not denying that. I've got patients, Steve, that I see that have had long COVID, that weren't vaccinated, okay, and have suffered quite badly. Most of the most serious aspects of COVID happened early on in 2020 and predominantly affected the elderly. We've got all of that data now that's been reanalyzed by one of the world's top scientists. And even looking back now, essentially, if you were under 70, even from the beginning, your risk of serious harm from COVID is in the ballpark figure of the flu, right? And even I actually was wrong. I wrote an article in European Scientist in April 2020, because I actually initially started making a lot of noise about why we're not talking about lifestyle with COVID to help people mitigate, improve their immune system. And I said, talking to a friend of mine who works in the busiest ER in America, in New York, who I've done work with, and he said, Aseem, I've never seen anything like this. This is devastating. Some of my colleagues are dying. So I have no doubt that at the very beginning, in the early strain of the virus, it was really bad, especially for vulnerable people with obesity, etc.
Because I remember getting COVID. I used to live on the top floor of this building, and I remember I've never experienced anything quite as bizarre as the symptom set that I had when I got COVID. The fact that at 3 a.m. in the morning, I don't take medicine. So the fact at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm lying flat on my floor ordering ibuprofen on Uber Eats because my back, I just had the most bizarre back pain. And so I was having to lie flat on the floor because I couldn't even lie in bed. It was so bad. And just this weird set of symptoms that I'd never had before. My partner, she lost her smell and taste, and it was so unusual. It was so unusual. There's not been a time in my lifetime that people have lost their smell and taste en masse. So when you hear it compared to the flu, you go, this was not the flu. This is something different.
Yes. No, the symptoms are very different. And I think now it's accepted that, and we won't go into a lot of detail on it, but I think one of the reasons as well, it was human engineered. It almost certainly the evidence points to it being a lab leak, right? So it had you're right, it was very different to any other virus.
That used to be a conspiracy theory.
I know, right?
Now it's not a conspiracy theory.
I know, exactly.
It's funny, yeah, when you hear about that lab in Wuhan that were messing around with viruses, and then we decided to put the blame on a market stall. But I think now the general consensus is that it probably came from that lab in Wuhan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I've spoken to, in fact, I spent time with actually the scientists that first went public with it, who identified it, guy in in Australia. That came from a lab. But so I think it had these different strange things, loss of smell, etc. But in terms of serious illness, it was there at the beginning. Now, when you look back, I think essentially there were vulnerable elderly, but who suffered, especially people in nursing homes. There were a lot of deaths there. But there's so many other components to this. So one is, did we institute the correct treatments? A lot of people were killed because they weren't managed properly in ITU, in terms of intubating them, putting on respirators when they didn't need it. And that in itself has a risk. Some of the wrong treatments were given. There were other treatments now that we look back that probably would have been helpful. Things like ivermectin, which I know has been a bit controversial, but it's very safer than paracetamol, right? So first, do no harm, okay? But it may have done some good, and a lot of people and doctors around the world that used it in several thousand. There's a doctor in South Africa that used it in 14,000 patients, including many elderly. Not a single one died from COVID, and this is early on. So all these things that we missed a lifestyle intervention. So all those things are there. But by the time you get to the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, there are so many things that happen, Steve, that you have to think about before you introduce a vaccine. One is, what is the state of the virus right now? And it had already mutated to some degree and become less lethal. There is natural immunity, which we know is very powerful, right? But the issue with the vaccine is, and certainly it was probably there from the beginning, we know that when one looks at the original trials, there was and this is what the drug companies have done for a long period of time, they will mislead people using statistics about the benefits. So use something called relative risk reduction. So let me just explain this, because you can apply this to statins as well. Is they presented the benefit as a 95% protection against infection. Remember that figure, 95%, right? And it was what we call relative risk reduction. So if you've got, for example, two groups in a trial, say 100 in one trial, in one group and 100 in another, and let's give you an example of statins, and you're following them up over 5 years to look at a drug to see if it benefits them in preventing having a heart attack. In one group, they get the dummy pill, and you follow them up over 5 years, and in the people that got the dummy pill, in fact, you didn't do anything different. 2 of them suffered a heart attack. In the other group, the other 100 people that were followed up over 5 years, who got the pill, the drug, right? Only 1 suffered a heart attack. So you've reduced the heart attack risk by 50%, right? Mm-hmm. 2 to 1, right? 50%. But you've only prevented 1 heart attack. You've treated 100 people, but you've prevented 1 heart attack out of treating 100. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that's a 1% absolute benefit. In other words, when you explain that to a patient, when I have engaged in sort of what we call informed consent, shared decision making, when they ask me about drug, I'll say, this gives you a 1% chance. if you take this drug religiously, of preventing a heart attack. Now, you apply that to the original COVID vaccine trials, which, by the way, have so many other problems with them, because even those trials were conducted and analyzed and designed by the drug industry. I mean, this is one of the biggest myths that needs to be busted, Steve, out there for most doctors, as well as members of the public. Medical knowledge is under commercial control, but most people don't know that. So what happens is they did the trial, but let's just talk about what the results, their results showed us. A 95% relative risk reduction against infection. They didn't show any reduction in COVID death, by the way, in that trial, right? They just said prevent from infection, but we then presume it may then prevent, right? Reduce death rates. The absolute risk reduction from infection at the beginning was 0.84%. 1 in 119. So that's how many people you need to vaccinate to prevent one infection, which actually people were not told. So imagine you're thinking, should I take this vaccine? Say, well, Steve, there's a less than 1% chance that it's going to prevent you getting infected. People weren't told that.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.